47 enslaved people saw what went down in the cotton field that September morning back in 1851. But here's the kicker. Not a single word of their testimony ever made it into the official records for Warren County, Mississippi. What they witnessed under that merciless sun would become a whispered legend in the slave quarters for generations, passed along in coded spirituals and quiet warnings, and always finished the exact same way, with a white man's blood soaking deep into Mississippi soil and an albino field hand who just vanished into thin air. The plantation books chalked up the death as nothing more than an accidental bleed-out. But the county coroner's notes, which were sealed shut for 73 years, tell a completely different story. Local historians have tried their best to explain away the conflicting evidence, the impossible timeline of events, and those strange marks they found carved into the cotton gin that morning. But what really happened on the Rutledge plantation was way darker than just a simple murder. It was something that made 47 people unanimously agree, without even having to speak a single word, to take a secret to their graves. Before we dig deeper into the story of Caleb and those blood-soaked cotton fields at the Rutledge plantation, I need to ask you something important. This channel is here to bring you the darkest, most unsettling stories from America's hidden history, the ones that were intentionally buried, the ones that truly challenge everything we think we know about the past. If this kind of history grabs your attention, if you want to hear more of the secrets that weren't ever meant to be shared, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now. I'm also curious about you. Where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Let's find out how many of you are brave enough to admit you're listening to this all alone late at night. Now, what actually took place on that plantation involved some careful planning, some forbidden knowledge brought over from the Caribbean, and a form of revenge so perfectly methodical and calculated that it would take modern forensic science decades just to start understanding how the hell it was even pulled off. The thing you have to understand about Mississippi in 1851 is that everyone kept track of everything. Plantation owners documented things with obsessive precision. Every bale of cotton, every slave they bought, every bushel of corn harvested. It was a whole society built on ledgers and manifests. It was a cold math of human suffering converted directly into profit margins, which makes what happened on a Rutledge place even more unsettling. Why? Because for 3 weeks in September that year, the records just stop. No cotton weights, no punishment logs, no morning roll calls, just blank pages where detailed accounting should have been. It's like somebody deliberately tried to wipe those weeks clean from history. The Rutledge plantation stretched out over 1,100 acres of prime Delta bottomland, sitting about 7 miles southeast of Vicksburg, where the Yazoo River bends like a broken spine. The dirt there was so rich and dark, it looked almost black when it got wet. The kind of ground that could grow cotton as tall as a man's shoulder. Cypress trees lined the river, their knees sticking out of the water like really old guards, and in the humid late summer stillness, the air was so thick you felt like you could chew it. Nathaniel Rutledge took over property from his father in 1847, inheriting 63 enslaved people, along with a reputation for being brutally efficient. He was a thin guy with pale eyes that always seemed to look straight through you instead of at you. And he ran that plantation with the cold mindset of a man who saw human beings as nothing more than machines that needed maintenance sometimes. The slaves at Rutledge's place worked longer hours than most folks in Warren County, and the overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Virgil Pence, was serious about discipline, enforcing it with a braided leather whip he actually called salvation. The main plantation house sat up on a small hill overlooking the fields, a 2-story place with white columns and a wraparound porch. That's where Rutledge would sit in the evenings, sipping his bourbon and watching the sun go down over the cotton that was making him rich. His wife had died giving birth 3 years before, and their son, a pale, sickly kid named Thomas, was being raised by a house slave named Patience, who had lost her own baby the same week Rutledge's wife passed away. Among the 63 souls working in those fields, one guy really stood out in a way that made even the other slaves nervous. His name in the books was just Caleb, purchased from a broke planter in Natchez in the summer of 1848 for the unusually cheap price of $300. The reason for the discount was immediately obvious. Caleb was an albino. His skin was as pale as any white man's, his hair the color of cottonlet. His eyes were a stunning pink that almost seemed to glow in certain light. He was 24 years old, tall and powerfully built. But that white skin labeled him as something other, something wrong, something that existed between two worlds. In the slave quarters, they called him Ghost, because of how he looked and because he moved with this eerie silence, just appearing and disappearing without making a sound. Some people said his mother was cursed. Others swore he was touched by spirits. But the truth, which a few of the older slaves knew, was actually more practical and way more terrifying. Caleb's mother had been a healer in Haiti before she was captured and brought to Louisiana. She had taught her son everything she knew about plants, about poisons, about the human body, and how you could mess with it through the careful use of knowledge that white doctors just blew off as superstition. Caleb rarely talked himself. He worked the fields with this intense focus, never complained, never slowed down, his strained eyes locked on some faraway spot that only he could see. The other slaves gave him a wide berth, not exactly because they were afraid of him, but because they sensed something in him that made them deeply uncomfortable, a patience that seemed endless, a stillness that suggested thoughts were moving beneath the surface, like currents in deep water. The summer of 1851 had been especially brutal. The heat felt like a physical weight pushing down, and the humidity was so awful that clothes never really dried out. By August, 3 slaves had already collapsed from heat stroke, and one, an older man named Marcus, had died face down in the cotton rows, his fingers still clutching the half-full sack he was dragging. Rutledge had the body taken away before sunset and cut everyone's rations by a quarter, claiming Marcus's death had wasted valuable working hours during the best part of the harvest season. It was in this kind of desperate, exhausted environment that people started noticing small changes around them, though nobody connected those changes to Caleb at the time. The well water started tasting a little bit bitter, though not enough that anyone would refuse it in that crushing heat. Several of the plantation dogs suddenly died, foaming at the mouth, and Pence blamed it on rabies, even though no other animals nearby showed any signs of the disease. Insects seemed to be more common than usual, especially flies and mosquitoes, and a few slaves got rashes that the plantation doctor said were just from the heat and poor hygiene. Rutledge himself started complaining about headaches in early August. He became more cranky than normal, quicker to anger, more brutal in his punishments. The house servants who brought him his meals realized he was eating less, that his hands sometimes shook when he lifted his bourbon glass, that he would sit out on the porch for hours on end just staring at nothing. She mentioned all this to old Isaiah, one of the field hands who'd been on the plantation longer than anyone else, and Isaiah said something that sent a chill through her. Master's being prepared, he told her. Someone's getting him ready. Caleb had been assigned a part of the field closest to the house that whole summer, close enough to watch Rutledge's daily routine, close enough to note when the master ate his meals, when he drank his bourbon, and when he visited the outhouse behind the main building. Several slaves later reported that Caleb had been collecting things, certain plants from the woods, bark from specific trees, and roots that he'd dry in the sun and grind down into powder. When anyone asked him what he was doing, he'd just say he was making medicine for his joints, which ached from a hard labor. But Isaiah knew better. His grandmother was from the islands, and she had taught him how to recognize the signs of someone practicing what she called slow work. This was a very careful, methodical use of natural substances that could slowly change a person's body chemistry over time, wearing them down, making them likely to catch diseases that would look completely natural to any doctor who examined them. Isaiah remembered his grandmother saying that the best poisons were the ones that killed so slowly the victim never even suspected they were being poisoned, the ones that left the body looking like it died of a natural illness. On the night of September 7th, a field hand named Samuel claimed he followed Caleb out into the woods past the cotton fields. He said he watched from behind a sweet gum tree as Caleb knelt by the creek and carefully washed his hands and forearms with a mixture that smelled sharp and medicinal. Then Caleb took a small cloth bundle from his pocket and unwrapped it, showing dried plant material that he sprinkled into the water while moving his lips in what looked like a prayer, but it might have just been counting. Samuel said that when Caleb got up, he looked directly at the tree where Samuel was hiding, and even in the darkness, those pale eyes found him instantly. Caleb didn't say anything. He just stared for a long moment before turning around and walking back toward the quarters. And Samuel understood right then that Caleb knew he'd been watched and simply didn't care. Samuel only told the story to 3 people, making them swear to secrecy. Within 2 days, all 3 had asked to be moved to different work details, as far away from Caleb as they could get. Pence actually agreed without asking any questions, maybe because he sensed something in their faces that made him uneasy about asking for details. Nathaniel Rutledge didn't notice any of this. His focus that September was all on cotton prices and yield numbers, though his ability to concentrate was getting worse and worse. His headaches had become intense, and he had started having spells of dizziness and feeling sick. The plantation doctor, an older gentleman named Hiram Kendrick, had examined him twice and couldn't find anything obviously wrong, though he did note that Rutledge's pulse felt weak and irregular. His skin was starting to look grayish, and his eyes seemed slightly yellow. Dr. Kendrick advised him to rest and cut back on the bourbon, advice Rutledge completely ignored. What the doctor didn't know, what no one knew except Caleb, was that for 3 months, small amount of carefully prepared plant extracts had been finding their way into Rutledge's food and drinks. Not enough to make him instantly sick, but enough to slowly weaken his heart system, make his blood vessels more fragile, and change his blood chemistry in ways that would turn catastrophic under the right circumstances. Caleb had learned from his mother that the human body could be manipulated just like any other system, that with patience and knowledge, a person could be brought to a point where a final trigger would cause their entire system to collapse. The plants Caleb used weren't exotic or hard to find. Pokeweed root grew everywhere in Mississippi, and in tiny doses it could cause internal bleeding. White snakeroot messed with blood clotting. Foxglove leaves disrupted heart rhythm. Water hemlock root, in minute amounts, could damage blood vessels. Every substance was meticulously measured, precisely timed, and carefully given through patients who brought Rutledge's meals and who had lost her own child to the master's cruelty. She asked no questions when Caleb handed her tiny vials of clear liquid to add to the bourbon decanter. By early September, Rutledge's body was basically a biological time bomb. His cardiovascular system was so weak that any major stress could set off a complete and utter failure. All that was missing was the perfect moment, the right trigger. On September 14th, a Saturday, Rutledge made a choice that would seal his fate, though he had no idea at the time. He had been drinking since early afternoon, and the bourbon made him even more irritable than usual. When Pence brought in the week's cotton weights, Rutledge flew into a rage. The numbers were down by almost 12% from the week before. Someone was slacking. Someone was stealing from him with their laziness. He demanded to know who was responsible for the shortage. Pence, who had his own reasons for disliking Caleb, and maybe hoped that pointing Rutledge's anger somewhere else would save himself, suggested that the albino had been working slower than usual. It was a total lie. Caleb's output had actually increased, but Pence saw an opportunity and took it. Rutledge immediately accepted this lie, maybe because it fit the prejudices he already had. Maybe the bourbon had muddied his thinking, or maybe, like Pence, he had felt a vague unease around Caleb that he couldn't quite explain, but now he could justify it as suspicion. The order was given. At sunrise on Monday, September 15th, Caleb was going to get 20 lashes in front of all the assembled slaves, and his food rations would be cut in half for 2 weeks. On top of that, he would be moved to work the section of the field closest to the overseer's shack, where Pence could watch his every move. The punishment was over the top, even for the harsh standards of the Rutledge plantation, and several of the older slaves exchanged worried glances when Pence announced it that evening. They had been watching the way Caleb had been moving all summer, the careful attention he had paid to everything around him, and they recognized the signs of a man preparing for something big. That night, no one in the slave quarters slept well. The air felt heavy, charged with something more than just humidity. Dogs on the surrounding farms barked nonstop from midnight until dawn, though that was probably just a pack of wild hogs moving through the area. Several people later said they heard noises they couldn't identify, though human memory is notoriously unreliable when it's dark and people are exhausted. Patience woke up 3 times from nightmares she couldn't remember. Each time, her heart was pounding and sweat was drenching her thin blanket. Caleb spent that night in his shack on the edge of the quarters, preparing the final element of his plan. From the rafters, he took down a small leather pouch that contained a powder he'd been working on for weeks. It was a highly concentrated mix of plants that, when breathed in or absorbed through mucous membranes, would cause rapid opening of the blood vessels and a catastrophic drop in blood pressure. The powder was extremely fine, almost like dust, and could be easily hidden and used. His mother had taught him how to make it, but she'd warned him it was dangerous just to handle. She told him it should only be used as a last resort because once it was deployed, the results were unstoppable and obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. He also got a small glass vial ready, holding a clear liquid. This was another extract designed to be applied to the skin where it would soak in through the skin and cause an immediate heart crisis in someone whose system was already weakened. The combination of months of slow poisoning followed by these 2 final agents would create a medical emergency so severe and quick that death would be certain. The symptoms would look exactly like a natural internal bleeding event that the doctors of that time would have no way to properly diagnose or treat. Monday morning came with a sky like hammered pewter and air so still that nothing moved, not even the leaves on the trees. The temperature was already 85. Ring operator. F 29.4. Ring operator. C. When the wake-up bell rang at 5 o'clock, and by the time the enslaved people had gathered in front of the big house, the heat was crushing, a physical weight that pressed down on shoulders and made breathing hard. Rutledge walked out onto his porch at 6 o'clock sharp, wearing a white linen suit despite the early hour. He was carrying his bourbon glass, even though it was barely dawn and his eyes were bloodshot from the night before. His hand shook slightly as he put the glass down on the porch railing, and his skin had a grayish color that showed his body was already struggling. Penn stood next to him, the whip called Salvation coiled up in his thick hands. The 63 enslaved people stood in rough rows facing the porch, their faces carefully blank, their eyes focused on nothing in particular. This was how they survived. Show no feeling. Don't reveal any thoughts. Be invisible even when you're standing in plain view. Bring out the albino, Rutledge said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead air, though it sounded strained as if speaking took effort. Caleb came out of the quarters, walking slowly, each step measured and deliberate. He was shirtless, his pale torso almost glowing in the growing light, and there were marks on his arms, scars he had given himself over the years. Each one stood for a person he had lost to the cruelty of slavery, each one a reminder of why he was doing this. His pink eyes were fixed on Rutledge with an intensity that made several slaves look away. He moved with a sense of purpose, like a man approaching the end of a long-planned process. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing slow and steady. In his right hand, hidden against his palm, was a small leather pouch with the powder. In his left hand, hidden against his wrist, was a tiny glass vial. He had practiced this moment in his head 1,000 times. He had planned every move, calculated every risk. Pence moved towards him with a whip, but something made the overseer hesitate. He would later tell the county sheriff that it felt uneasy, that something about Caleb's stillness was unnerving, though he couldn't say why. But Rutledge was watching, and pride pushed Pence forward. Strip him to the waist and tie him to the post, Rutledge ordered, even though Caleb was already shirtless. 2 slaves, men who had known Caleb for 3 years but never felt comfortable around him, approached cautiously. They took his arms to lead him to the whipping post, a thick timber put deep into the earth specifically for this purpose. But as they grabbed his arms, Caleb suddenly twisted, breaking their grip with surprising strength. Before anyone could even react, he had moved forward, closing the distance to Rutledge in 3 quick steps. "You will not touch me," Caleb said, his voice low, but cutting clearly. "Not with that whip. Not ever again." Rutledge's face turned pale, then flushed red with fury. He walked down the porch steps, moving toward Caleb with his fists clenched, his judgment blurred by bourbon and building rage. "You dare refuse me? You dare speak to me like that?" This was exactly what Caleb had been waiting for. Rutledge was close enough to touch, his blood pressure already spiked by anger, his compromised heart system pushed to its limit by rage and alcohol. As Rutledge reached for him, Caleb made 2 movements so fast that most witnesses would later disagree on exactly what they saw. First, he crushed the leather pouch in his right hand, releasing the fine powder directly into Rutledge's face. The master breathed in sharply, gasping in shock and anger, drawing the powder deep into his lungs where it would be instantly absorbed into his bloodstream. Second, as Rutledge staggered back, coughing and sputtering, Caleb's left hand shot out and made contact with Rutledge's chest, just above his heart. The touch lasted less than a second, but it was enough time for the liquid from the broken vial, which Caleb had crushed against his own palm, to transfer to Rutledge's skin right through his thin linen shirt. The effect wasn't instant, but it was rapid. The powder inhaled into Rutledge's lungs caused immediate, severe widening of the blood vessels, dropping his blood pressure catastrophically. The liquid absorbed through his chest caused his already weak heart to start beating erratically. Too fast, then too slow, unable to keep up proper circulation, and his blood vessels, which had been weakened by months of slow poisoning, began to rupture internally. Rutledge froze. His hands went to his chest, grabbing at the spot where Caleb had touched him. His eyes grew wide with confusion, and then the first hint of terror. And then, with everyone watching, a red stain began to spread across the white linen of his shirt, right where Caleb had made contact. But there was no external wound. What was happening was internal bleeding so bad that blood was being forced to the pores of the skin, through his sweat glands, seeping out through intact skin in a way that would have been medically impossible without the specific combination of substances Caleb had given him over months. Blood started running from Rutledge's nose, from his ears, from the corners of his eyes. His mouth filled with blood as internal bleeding in his lungs made him cough up dark, thick streams of it. Rutledge staggered backward, his hands clawing at his chest, his eyes huge with confusion and mounting horror. He tried to speak, but blood came out his mouth instead of words, thick and dark, running over his chin and down his neck. He looked at Caleb with a look that was a mix of bafflement and pure terror, and Caleb looked back with eyes that held. Something that might have been satisfaction, might have been vindication, might have been simply the acknowledgement that a long-planned action had finally been carried out. "Walk to the field," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady. "Walk to the center of your cotton, where you have built your wealth on our bodies. Walk there and know what you have done." And, remarkably, impossibly, Rutledge turned and started walking toward the cotton fields. Medical science would later suggest he was in shock, that his brain was starved of oxygen, that he was acting on some final, automatic impulse. But in that moment, it looked like he was obeying Caleb's command, as if the albino slave had somehow taken control of the dying man's final moments. Rutledge's movements were stiff, mechanical, and blood kept pouring from his chest, his mouth, his nose, and ears, drenching his white suit until it was completely red. He left a trail of crimson drops in the dust, each one marking his path, each one soaking into the earth he had worked slaves to death to cultivate. Penn stood paralyzed, his mouth moving without a sound. The assembled slaves watched in silence, and even though many of them hated Rutledge with intensity that kept them going through years of brutality, what they saw right then was beyond simple murder. It was an execution, methodical and planned, carried out by a man who had spent months preparing, who had used knowledge most of them didn't have, who had turned the master's own body into a weapon against itself. Rutledge reached the edge of the cotton field and pushed between the rows, the tall plants swallowing him from view. But the slaves could track his progress by the swaying of the cotton tops, by the wet sounds that carried across the still morning air, by the crows that suddenly erupted from the field in a black cloud, shouting their alarm to the indifferent sky. Caleb stood motionless, watching Rutledge disappear into the cotton. His hands hung at his sides, stained red from the broken vial and from where Rutledge's blood had splashed onto him. His breathing was even, controlled, and his face showed absolutely no emotion. He had planned this moment for 3 years, ever since the day he was bought and recognized in Rutledge the exact same cruelty he'd seen in his previous owners, the same casual violence, the same absolute belief that human beings could be owned, used, and thrown away. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The sun cleared the horizon, turning the sky from gray to pale blue, and the heat built with an intensity that felt personal, vindictive. No one moved. No one spoke. They waited, though for what, none of them could have said for sure. They were waiting to see if Rutledge would come out of the field. They were waiting to see what Caleb would do next. They were waiting for reality to kick back in and make sense of what they had just seen. Finally, the swaying cotton fell still. The wet sound stopped. A silence descended that felt absolute, as if the world had stopped breathing. Caleb turned to face the assembled slaves. He looked at each of them in turn, his pale eyes moving from face to face, and then he spoke, clearly enough for everyone to hear. He died from his own cruelty, from years of bad living, bad drinking, bad choices. His body gave out because he drove it as hard as he drove us. The doctor will find nothing that points to anything except natural causes. A hemorrhagic event, a stroke, a heart failure, something his body was always going to do eventually. I simply made sure it happened today, in front of all of you, so you would know that monsters are not invincible. They are just men, and men can die. Then Caleb walked toward the quarters, grabbed his few belongings, and disappeared into the woods before Pence could gather enough sense to try and stop him. By the time the overseer managed to organize any kind of search, Caleb was gone, and he would never be found, despite wide searches. The immediate aftermath was chaos restricted by terror. Pence, who had finally been able to move, wanted to run into the field right away to check on Rutledge. But something, call it instinct, call it the primal part of the brain that recognizes danger before conscious thought can process it, kept him frozen to the spot for several more minutes. When he finally forced himself to move, he grabbed 3 slaves he considered reliable, men who had been on the plantation for years, who had never caused trouble, and ordered them at gunpoint to goad him into the field. They followed the trail of blood drops Rutledge had left, the crimson spots already turning brown in the sun, each one marking his path like some terrible breadcrumb trail. The cotton plants were taller than usual that year, nearly 7 feet high, and moving between the rows felt like walking through a maze. The leaves brushed against their skin with a sound like whispering, and flies had started to gather, their buzzing getting louder as the group pushed deeper into the field. They found Rutledge in a clearing at the center of the field, in a spot where the cotton had been planted in a circle about 10 feet across. He was lying on his back, his arms spread wide, his legs straight. His white suit was now totally red, soaked through with blood, and more blood had pooled underneath him, soaking into the earth in a dark stain that would be visible for weeks. But it was his face that made 2 of the 3 slaves immediately turn and run, leaving Pence and the remaining man, an older slave named Isaiah, staring down in horror. Rutledge's skin was paper white, so pale it was almost transparent, drained of blood to a degree that seemed impossible. His eyes were open, staring up at the sky, but they were filmed over and colorless. His mouth hung loose, and his tongue looked bleached. Every visible inch of skin was covered in tiny red dots, petechiae, where capillaries had burst and bled beneath the surface. Blood had dried in streams from his nose, his ears, the corners of his eyes, and his mouth. But despite the obvious horror of his death, despite what must have been agonizing as his blood vessels burst throughout his body, Rutledge's face showed neither pain nor fear. Instead, he looked almost peaceful, almost relaxed, and this was perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. That expression suggested that in his final moments, his brain starved of oxygen and flooded with endorphins, he had experienced something like relief, like a release, as if death had been a mercy compared to whatever terror had gripped him in those final conscious minutes. Isaiah, who had seen more death in his 60 years than any man should, took one look at that expression and said a single word: poison. Pence asked what he meant, and Isaiah shook his head. Not regular poison that kills you quick. Something slow, something careful. He paused. This took planning. This took knowledge. That ghost knew what he was doing. He has been preparing Master Rutledge for this moment for months, and none of us saw it. And an examination by Dr. Hiram Kendrick later that afternoon would confirm Isaiah's suspicions, though the doctor would never speak of it publicly. Kendrick was old and experienced enough to recognize systematic poisoning when he saw it. Rutledge's liver was enlarged and showed signs of toxic damage. His kidneys were inflamed. His cardiovascular system showed evidence of chronic stress and damage to the blood vessel walls. The massive bleeding that killed him wasn't spontaneous. It was a final result of months of careful preparation, the peak of a plan that had weakened every system in Rutledge's body until a final trigger could cause a complete collapse. Dr. Kendrick found traces of plant material in Rutledge's lungs, a fine powder he couldn't identify, but which had clearly been inhaled shortly before death. He found chemical burns on Rutledge's chest where some corrosive substance had been absorbed through the skin. He estimated that Rutledge had lost nearly 5 quarts of blood, most of it internally, and that the hemorrhage had occurred through thousands of ruptured capillaries throughout his entire body. It was a medical event so catastrophic that Kendrick had never seen anything like it in 40 years of practice. This was murder, Kendrick wrote in his preliminary notes, which he carefully sealed and hid. Sophisticated, calculated, and executed with knowledge that rivals or exceeds my own medical training. The perpetrator understood human physiology, understood pharmacology, understood exactly how to weaken a human body over time, and then deliver a final blow that would cause system-wide failure. This was not the work of an ignorant field hand. This was the work of someone with extensive training in the use of natural substances as weapons. But Dr. Kendrick also understood the implications of making such a statement public. To admit that a slave had the knowledge and skill to commit such a sophisticated murder would mean admitting that slaves were not the ignorant, childlike beings that white society insisted they were. It would mean recognizing that knowledge could be preserved and passed down even under the brutal conditions of slavery. That resistance could take forms far more sophisticated than just simple rebellion or escape. And it would open questions about how many other deaths blamed on natural causes might actually have been carefully planned executions. So, Dr. Kendrick wrote a second report, the official one that would go into the public record. In this version, he blamed Rutledge's death on a spontaneous hemorrhagic fever, possibly linked to heavy alcohol use and a congenital weakness in the blood vessel walls. He made no mention of poisoning. He made no mention of the powder in the lungs or the chemical burns on the chest. He created a narrative that would allow society to avoid uncomfortable truths. The county sheriff, Silas Harwood, arrived at 4 that afternoon. He was a practical man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, and he handled the scene with the systematic thoroughness that had earned him respect throughout Warren County. He interviewed Pence first, then several of the house slaves, noting every statement carefully. But the stories he heard were conflicting and confusing. Some slaves said Caleb had attacked Rutledge. Others said Rutledge had approached Caleb in anger. Some claimed Caleb had thrown something in Rutledge's face. Others said he had simply touched him. No one could agree on exactly what happened in those critical seconds. When Sheriff Hardwick went to the slave quarters to check Caleb's shack, he found it empty of anything useful. Caleb's few belongings, a blanket, a tin cup, a spare shirt, were still there, but there was no evidence of the preparations he must have made. No vials of powder or liquid, no dried plants or roots, no tools or implements. Either Caleb had taken everything with him, or he had destroyed it before leaving, or maybe it had never existed in a form that would be recognized as evidence. Hardwick immediately organized a search party. 20 men with dogs combed the plantation and the surrounding woods, looking for any trace of the missing slave. The dogs picked up his scent easily enough and followed it to the edge of the Yazoo River at a muddy bank, where a single set of footprints led into the water and disappeared. The men searched both banks for miles in each direction, but found nothing. No footprints emerging. No sign of a body in the water. Nothing. Either he drowned, Sheriff Hardwick said, or he crossed the river and kept moving fast enough that the dogs lost his scent on the other side. They dragged the river for 3 days, more out of thoroughness than any real expectation of finding anything. They never found a body, which wasn't too surprising. The Yazoo River was deep and had strong currents in places, and bodies caught in submerged debris might never surface. But several members of the search party privately believed that Caleb hadn't drowned, that he had crossed the river and was already miles away, heading north toward free territory with the same careful planning he had used to kill Rutledge. The inquest into Nathaniel Rutledge's death was held on September 20th, 5 days after he died. The courthouse in Vicksburg was packed with curious onlookers, and the testimony lasted 8 hours. Pence described what he had seen, though his account was vague and contradictory on key details. Dr. Kendrick testified about his findings, carefully presenting the official story of natural causes. Several slaves were called to testify, though under Mississippi law, their testimony was given less weight than that of white witnesses, and their accounts were largely dismissed as confused and unreliable. The verdict was recorded as death by spontaneous hemorrhagic event, natural causes. A reward of $500 was posted for Caleb's capture, dead or alive, not for murder, but for being a fugitive slave who had run away from his legal owner's property. Sheriff Hardwick sent descriptions to every county in Mississippi and to law enforcement in neighboring states. Newspapers published accounts of the albino fugitive and warned citizens to be on the lookout for a dangerous runaway. But the people who were there, who had seen what actually happened, knew the truth. In the slave quarters, they spoke in whispers about what Caleb had done, about the patience and knowledge it must have taken, about the months of careful preparation. Some said his mother had taught him secrets from Haiti, old knowledge about plants and poisons that white doctors didn't understand. Others claimed he had learned from other slaves who had been healers in Africa before they were captured. A few insisted he had taught himself, had experimented and studied, and learned through careful observation over years of being enslaved. Patience, who had unwittingly helped Caleb by adding the substances to Rutledge's food and drink, told the others something that chilled them to the bone. 3 days before it happened, she said, Caleb came to me with a small vial. He said it was medicine for Master's headaches, that it would help him rest. He told me exactly how much to put in the bourbon decanter, and he made me repeat the instructions 3 times. And then he looked at me and said, in 3 days, you will be free of him. In 3 days, his cruelty ends. Do not question. Do not hesitate. Just do as I've asked. I thought he meant Master would sell us or die of natural causes. I did not understand what he was actually planning until it was too late to stop it. And the terrible thing is, I do not regret it. None of us do. Young Thomas, Rutledge never really recovered from that morning. The boy had watched everything from an upstairs window, had seen his father die in a way no child should ever witness, and the trauma left deep psychological scars. He stopped speaking for nearly a year, and when he finally started talking again, he would sometimes wake up screaming from nightmares about the white ghost who made father bleed. Doctors examined him and found nothing physically wrong. But the boy had retreated into some inner world where normal childhood couldn't reach him. He would live another 43 years being cared for by various relatives, never marrying, never working, spending his days staring out windows, and sometimes pointing at nothing visible, muttering words that no one could quite make out. The plantation was sold at auction 6 months later. The slaves were deliberately split up and distributed among several buyers to prevent them from discussing what they had witnessed. The new owners found the property hard to manage. Several overseers quit within weeks, claiming the slaves were unsettled and unresponsive, though the real reason was probably that the story of what had happened had spread, and no white man wanted to be the next victim of similar treatment. The cotton field where Rutledge had died was plowed under and replanted, but the soil in that central circle where his body had lain never produced healthy plants again. For 3 growing seasons in a row, cotton planted in that exact spot withered and died, the leaves turning yellow and falling off too soon. Agricultural experts checked the soil and found nothing obviously wrong, though some privately suggested that the massive amount of blood that had soaked into the earth might have changed its chemistry in a way that stopped plant growth. By 1854, the new owner had given up on the property entirely, and the fields went back to wilderness. The story might have ended there, just fading into local legend, except for what came out years later through the testimonies of the people who had been there and who, after emancipation, felt free to speak more openly about what they had seen and understood. In 1874, 23 years after Rutledge's death, Isaiah Carmichael, the same Isaiah who had gone into the field with Pence that terrible morning, was dying of pneumonia in a freedmen's hospital in Memphis. He had spent the years after emancipation working as a carpenter, living quietly, raising a family. But on his deathbed, with his grown children gathered around him, he suddenly started talking about September 15th, 1851, giving details he had kept silent about for more than 2 decades. What Isaiah revealed was recorded by a hospital chaplain named Reverend Marcus Sullivan, who made a practice to document the final accounts of formerly enslaved people, believing their stories deserved to be preserved. Sullivan's notebooks, found in a church archive in 1947, contained 17 pages dedicated to Isaiah's confession. According to Isaiah, the events of that morning didn't start with a fight between Caleb and Rutledge. They started 3 months earlier, in June of 1851, when Caleb had asked Isaiah to help him with something. Isaiah had been hesitant. Like everyone else, he felt awkward around the albino, but Caleb offered him extra food from his own rations, and Isaiah's children were hungry, so he agreed. Caleb led him into the woods at midnight on the night of the summer solstice, though the importance of that specific night was likely more psychological than practical. Caleb understood that creating an atmosphere of ritual and secrecy would guarantee Isaiah's silence. There, in a clearing by the creek, Isaiah watched as Caleb showed him various plants growing wild in the Mississippi woods. He knew every plant by name, Isaiah said on his deathbed, his voice barely a whisper. Not the names white folks used, but old names from the islands and from Africa. He showed me pokeweed and told me how the root could be dried and ground into a powder that would cause bleeding inside the body if taken in small amounts over time. He showed me white snakeroot and explained how it poisoned the milk of cows that ate it and how that same poison could be extracted and used within a man's blood until it wouldn't clot properly. He showed me Foxglove and described how it could make a heartbeat irregular, could weaken it over months until it was ready to fail. He showed me water hemlock and demonstrated how to prepare the root, so it would damage blood vessels without killing immediately. Isaiah said that Caleb had been collecting these plants since he arrived at the plantation 3 years earlier, learning the land, finding the species he needed, waiting for the right chance. He told me he had done this before. Isaiah said he told me his mother had taught him because she knew that as an albino, he would always be treated worse than other slaves, would always be seen as strange and threatening, would always be the first one blamed when things went wrong. She taught him how to protect himself, how to strike back when needed, how to use knowledge as a weapon when physical strength wasn't enough. Over the next 3 months, Isaiah said Caleb had prepared his substances meticulously. He had dried and ground plant materials, had tested them on rats and stray dogs to figure out the right dosages, had created mixtures that would be tasteless and colorless when added to food or drink. He had convinced patients to help him by telling her that the substances were medicine that would make Rutledge less cruel, would calm his rages, would make life easier for all of them. Patients had believed him because she wanted to believe him, because the only other option was to keep living under Rutledge's brutal rule. Caleb told me the key was patience, Isaiah said, his breathing getting more labored. He said most poisons kill too quickly, make it obvious that murder happened. But if you weaken a man slowly over months, making him sick in ways that look like a natural illness. Then when the final moment comes, when you give him the substance that causes his weakened body to collapse completely, it looks like he simply died of bad health. He told me he learned this by watching white doctors, watching how they dealt with diseases, understanding that the human body was just a system like any other system, and systems could be manipulated if you understood how they worked. The final substances Caleb had used on the morning of September 15th had been the climax of months of preparation. The powder he had thrown in Rutledge's face was a concentrated mixture designed to be inhaled, to enter the bloodstream to the lungs, and cause rapid vasodilation. This sudden widening of blood vessels would drop blood pressure catastrophically in someone whose cardiovascular system had already been compromised. The liquid he had applied to Rutledge's chest was an extract that could be absorbed through skin, especially the thin skin like that covering the chest, and that would cause the heart to beat erratically, failing to pump blood effectively. He told me the hemorrhaging would be spectacular. Isaiah said Rutledge's body was so weakened that when these final substances took effect, blood vessels throughout his body would rupture. He said it would look impossible, would look like something supernatural, but it was just chemistry and biology. He said it was justice rendered in the only form available to someone with no legal recourse, no rights, no protection under law. He said it was mathematics, balancing an equation where one man's life and freedom had been stolen, so another man's life would be taken in return. Isaiah died 3 hours after finishing his account, and Reverend Sullivan sealed the testimony in an envelope marked not to be opened before 1900. His reasoning, recorded in a separate letter, was that publishing such an account while racial tensions remained high could endanger freed black communities by reinforcing white fears about the knowledge that enslaved people possessed. He reasoned it was better to wait until time had created enough distance for the story to be examined rationally and historically rather than emotionally. But Isaiah's testimony was not the only evidence that surfaced in the years following Rutledge's death. In 1881, a historian named Margaret Chambers was researching plantation records for a book about the antebellum South when she discovered something unusual in the Natchez Courthouse archives. Among the slave sale records from 1848, she found a receipt for Caleb's purchase, the transaction where Rutledge had acquired him for the unusually low price of $300. The selling planner's name was Rene Toussaint, and the notation beside Caleb's name read, "Albino male, age 21, strong constitution, unsuitable for house service due to disturbing appearance. Warning, previous owner deceased under suspicious circumstances. Recommend sale outside Louisiana territory. Additional note, claims mother was healer from Saint-Domingue. Medical examination shows knowledge of plants and herbs. Purchaser assumes all risk." Margaret Chambers tracked down additional records related to Toussaint's plantation. She discovered that the previous owner mentioned in the warning was a man named Jacques Bogard, who had died in March of 1848 from what the death certificate described as spontaneous hemorrhaging from all mucous membranes and vital organs. 3 slaves from that plantation had been sold immediately after Bogard's death, and one of them was Caleb. When Chambers tried to trace Caleb's history before Bogard, she found the record became increasingly sparse and contradictory, likely because slaves were often deliberately misidentified or had their records falsified to hide problematic histories. One bill of sale listed his birthplace as Haiti. Another claimed he had been born in New Orleans. A third insisted he had been purchased from a slave trader in Mobile. The conflicting information made it impossible to construct a coherent timeline, and Chambers began to suspect the records had been deliberately obscured by slave traders who knew they were dealing with a dangerous individual, but wanted to make sales anyway. What she did find was a pattern. In every location where Caleb had been enslaved, she found report of an owner or overseer dying under unusual circumstances. A plantation in Louisiana, where the master was found dead in a tobacco barn, his body drained of blood from massive internal hemorrhaging. A farm in Alabama where the overseer's body was discovered in a field, bloodless and pale as marble. A cotton gin in Georgia where the owner had collapsed and died while disciplining a slave, blood pouring from his eyes and ears. In each case, An albino slave had been present on the property. In each case, that slave had vanished or been sold shortly after the death. And in each case, local authorities had written off the deaths as natural causes, accidents, or the result of tropical diseases. No one wanted to believe that a slave, especially one as obviously marked as an albino, could possess the knowledge and planning ability to commit such sophisticated murders. Margaret Chambers never published her findings. Her notes, discovered after her death in 1903, suggest she had become convinced that she was tracing not a series of unrelated coincidences, but rather a single individual moving through the South, changing owners when necessary, settling accounts with those who treated him most cruelly, using knowledge passed down from his mother to survive, and occasionally to strike back. But the implications of such a theory were too disturbing for the time period, and she had sealed her research with instructions that it not be made public until 1950. "If I am right," she wrote in her private journal, "the Caleb represents something that white society has always feared but never wanted to acknowledge, that enslaved people possess intelligence, knowledge, and agency equal to or exceeding that of their oppressors, that they remember everything done to them, that they pass down knowledge across generations, that they are capable of sophisticated long-term planning, that they can use the tools of science and medicine as effectively as any trained physician, and that when pushed beyond endurance, they can deliver justice in forms that white legal systems would never recognize as valid, but which are nonetheless devastatingly effective." Meanwhile, reports of Caleb's survival and movements continued to surface sporadically over the years following his disappearance. In 1856, a riverboat captain on the Ohio River reported giving passage to an albino man who claimed to be a freed slave heading to Canada. The captain noted in his log that the man had paid in gold coins and that his hands were covered in scars that looked like deliberate patterns, possibly self-inflicted as a form of identification or record-keeping. "He was the politest passenger I ever carried," the captain wrote. But there was something in his manner that suggested he had seen and done things that would haunt most men forever. He spoke little, but watched everything, and I had the distinct impression he was cataloging every detail of the journey, as if committing it to memory for some future use. In 1863, during the Battle of Gettysburg, a Union surgeon named Dr. Henry Walsh reported treating a soldier with unusual scarring who claimed to be an escaped slave fighting under an assumed name. Dr. Walsh noted that the soldier's appearance was remarkably pale, almost albino, and that he possessed medical knowledge that exceeded that of most field surgeons. He assisted me with several amputations and demonstrated techniques for controlling hemorrhaging that I had never seen before. Walsh wrote, "When I asked where he had learned such skills, he said his mother had been a healer and had taught him everything she knew. He said, knowledge was the only thing that could not be taken from a slave, the only form of resistance that was impossible to suppress." The soldier had told Walsh that he was fighting in the war not because of patriotism, but because of the belief that the destruction of slavery required the destruction of the economic and social systems that supported it. He said the war was justice being delivered on a national scale. Walsh recorded the accumulated debts of generations being settled in blood and fire. The soldier said he'd spent years settling individual accounts, but this war would settle the larger account, the one that included millions of stolen lives and generations of suffering. He said he would survive the war because he had survived worse, and that when it was over, he would continue his work in whatever form was needed. Dr. Walsh never saw the soldier again after battle, but he kept detailed notes about their conversations, notes that would be discovered in 1923 and would add to the growing body of evidence that someone matching Caleb's description had survived his escape from Mississippi and had kept moving through American history, adapting to changing times but maintaining the same core purpose. In 1879, a missionary teacher in a freedmen's school in South Carolina reported an unusual visitor who came to observe her classes. She described him in a letter to her sponsors as a remarkably pale Negro man with white hair and pink eyes who claimed to have been born in slavery, but who possessed an education that matched or exceeded her own. The teacher, Sarah Grimsby, wrote that the visitor had donated a substantial sum of money to the school, more than $200 in gold, and had told her something she found both inspiring and unsettling. He said education was the key to ensuring that the crimes of slavery would never be forgotten or repeated, Grimsby wrote. He said that every child who learned to read and write was a witness who could testify to history, who could preserve memory across generations, who could ensure that truth would eventually prevail over the lies that had upheld slavery. But he also said something darker. He said that some debts could never be fully repaid, that some crimes were so great that justice could only be approximated, never achieved. He said he'd spent his life trying to balance accounts that were fundamentally unbalanceable, and that the frustration of that impossible task was its own form of torture. I asked him why he continued if he believed the task was impossible, Grimsby wrote. And he looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his apparent age and said, because memory must be honored, because the dead deserve to have their suffering acknowledged, even if it cannot be undone. These scattered reports, collected by various researchers over the decades, never amounted to definitive proof that a single individual had survived from 1848 through 1879 and beyond. They could be explained as different people with similar looks and backgrounds, but taken together, they suggested something else, that Caleb had indeed escaped successfully, had made his way north, had survived the Civil War, and had continued living with the knowledge of what he'd done and what had been done to him. The most disturbing evidence emerged in 1911, 60 years after Rutledge's death, when the Yazoo River flooded catastrophically, submerging large parts of Warren County under 15 feet of muddy water. When the waters went back down 3 weeks later, the landscape had been fundamentally changed. The river had jumped its banks and carved a new channel, uncovering sections of bottomland that had been underwater or buried in silt for decades. Among the debris and mud left behind, workers cleaning up near the site of the old Rutledge plantation made a discovery that would restart the investigation into events from 60 years earlier. Buried in a mud bank, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a metal box that had protected them from water damage, they found the personal journals of Nathaniel Rutledge, covering the period from January 1851 to September 14, 1851, the day before his death. The journals were given to the County Historical Society, where they sat for 3 years before anyone read them closely. When they were finally examined by a local historian named Thomas Everett in 1914, they revealed details that fundamentally changed the understanding of what had happened in September 1851. According to his journal entries, Rutledge had been aware that something was wrong with his health. Starting in late June 1851, he described having persistent headaches, spells of dizziness, and unusual fatigue. He had consulted Dr. Kendrick multiple times, but the doctor had found nothing obviously wrong and blamed the symptoms on stress and excessive drinking. Rutledge had initially accepted this diagnosis, but as the weeks went by and his symptoms got worse, he began to suspect something else was happening. "I am beginning to fear that I have been poisoned," Rutledge wrote on August 15th. "My symptoms do not match any natural illness I have experienced or read about. The headaches come and go without pattern. My vision blurs unexpectedly. I feel weakness in my limbs that has no obvious cause, and most disturbing, I have noticed small spots of blood appearing on my pillow in the mornings, as if I am bleeding from my nose or mouth during sleep, though I never feel it happening. Dr. Kendrick dismisses my concerns and suggests I'm imagining things, but I know my own body, and something is systematically wrong with it." The journal entries from late August and early September showed Rutledge's suspicions hardening into certainty. He began writing down everything he ate and drank, trying to find pattern. He started suspecting various slaves of tampering with his food, but his focus kept coming back to one individual, though he seemed hesitant to name him directly in the journals. "The albino watches me," Rutledge wrote on September 3rd. "I see him in the fields, and his eyes follow me as I ride past. There is something in that gaze that unsettles me profoundly. Not hatred, which I could understand and respond with punishment. Not fear, which would be appropriate and satisfying, but rather a kind of patient calculation, as if he is measuring me for something, as if he is waiting for a specific moment that only he can recognize. I have considered selling him, but the financial loss would be significant, and I would have to explain why I am selling a strong worker in the middle of harvest season. What would I say? That I fear him? That his stare makes me uncomfortable? I would be mocked. The entries from September 10th through September 14th showed Rutledge's physical and mental state getting worse fast. He described tasting a bitterness in his bourbon that hadn't been there before. He reported seeing blood in his urine. He noted that his gums bled when he brushed his teeth, that bruises appeared on his skin without any memory of injury, that his heart seemed to beat irregularly, skipping beats and then racing to catch up. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Warren County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The final entry, dated September 14th, the night before his death, was barely legible. The handwriting was shaky and increasingly erratic as the entry progressed. I know now what is happening to me. I consulted a medical text that Dr. Kendrick left behind after his last visit, and I have identified my symptoms as consistent with systematic poisoning by plant-based substances. The specific combination suggests someone with sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology far beyond what any slave should possess. But I remember now that when I bought the albino from Descent, the seller warned me that the slave's mother had been some kind of healer or medicine woman from Haiti. I dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, but now I understand it was a warning. I should have listened. The albino has been poisoning me for months, carefully and methodically, weakening my body in preparation for some final action. I can see it clearly now, though the realization comes too late to save me. He has been using patience to deliver the substances in my food and drink. The innocent girl not understanding that she is an instrument of murder. He has been patient in ways I cannot fathom, waiting months to achieve his goal, displaying capacity for long-term planning that contradicts everything I've been taught about the mental capabilities of his race. I could report my suspicions to Sheriff Hardwick, but what proof do I have? A feeling of being watched? Vague suspicions about an albino slave? The sheriff would think me paranoid or drunk. I could free all my slaves and flee, could abandon this plantation and start over somewhere else. But my pride would not allow it. I have built this place with my own hands, have created wealth from nothing, and I will not be driven from it by a slave, no matter how clever or dangerous. Tomorrow I will confront him publicly. I will have him whipped in front of all the others, will reassert my authority, will show that I am not afraid. Perhaps this will force his hand prematurely, before whatever final action he has planned is ready. Or perhaps I am already doomed, and tomorrow will simply be the day my weakened body finally fails. If so, I pray that my death serves as a warning to others. Never underestimate the enslaved. They remember everything. They learn everything. And given the right knowledge and enough patience, they can destroy you as surely as any army, as thoroughly as any disease. Thomas Everett, who discovered these journal entries, was deeply troubled by what they revealed. Unlike the official story that was created in 1851, a story of an unprovoked attack by a violent slave, Rutledge's own words prove it had understood exactly what was being done to him, had identified Caleb as a perpetrator, and had made a conscious decision to confront him anyway, driven by pride and by an unwillingness to admit that a slave could outwit him. Everett began investigating further, looking for any other documentation that might shed light on the events. He found the sealed coroner's notes from 1851, which Dr. Kendrick had hidden away. Reading them alongside Rutledge's journal created a complete picture of what had happened. Months of careful poisoning using plant extracts, ending in a final use of substances that triggered catastrophic bleeding in a body that had been systematically weakened and prepared for exactly that outcome. What emerges from these documents, Everett wrote in his analysis, is not a story of supernatural revenge or divine justice, but rather a case study in sophisticated murder carried out by someone with extensive knowledge of human physiology and pharmacology. Caleb was not a monster or a ghost or a supernatural being. He was simply a highly intelligent man who had been taught valuable knowledge by his mother and who used that knowledge to survive in a system designed to destroy him. When that system threatened to destroy him through excessive punishment, he defended himself in the only way available to him, by eliminating the threat. Everett published his findings in 1915 in a limited edition monograph titled The Albino's Revenge, a study in antebellum murder. The book sold poorly and was largely dismissed by mainstream historians as sensationalistic, though medical professionals who read it recognized the accuracy of Everett's analysis of the poisoning method. The book caught the attention of several researchers interested in the ways enslaved people had resisted their bondage, and it contributed to a growing understanding that resistance took many forms, not all of them dramatic or immediately visible. One of these researchers, an anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Osgood, traveled to Haiti in 1922 to investigate the traditions of healing and plant medicine that might have been passed down to people like Caleb's mother. There she interviewed several traditional healers who confirmed that such knowledge had indeed existed and had been carefully preserved even after the Middle Passage. The healers I spoke with described extensive pharmacological knowledge that had been developed over centuries in Africa and refined in the Caribbean. Dr. Osgood wrote in her field notes, "They could identify hundreds of plants by sight and knew their properties, which ones could heal, which ones could kill, which ones could be used in combination to achieve specific effects. This knowledge was considered sacred and was typically passed only from parent to child, or from master to apprentice within secret societies. The fact that an enslaved woman would teach such knowledge to her son suggests she understood he would need every possible advantage to survive." Dr. Osgood's research confirmed that the substances Caleb had used were all native to Mississippi or could have been found growing wild in the region. Pokeweed, white snakeroot, foxglove, and water hemlock were all common plants that knowledgeable people understood could be dangerous if used improperly or effective if used with intent. The sophistication lay not in using exotic or rare substances, but in understanding dosages, timing, and combinations that would achieve a desired effect without being immediately obvious. What Caleb accomplished required extensive knowledge, careful observation, meticulous planning, and extraordinary patience, Dr. Osgood concluded. It also required a willingness to accept that he might die in the attempt, that his plan might be discovered, that he might face torture and execution if caught. The fact that he succeeded, that he escaped, and that he apparently survived for decades afterward suggests a level of intelligence, courage, and determination that should force us to reconsider every assumption we have made about the capabilities and agency of enslaved people. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in the most unexpected way, through a source that initially seemed questionable, but which ultimately provided crucial confirmation of the entire narrative. In 1947, 96 years after Rutledge's death, a package arrived at the Warren County Historical Society, postmarked from Toronto, Canada. It had been mailed anonymously and contained a handwritten letter along with a small leather-bound journal. The letter was brief and written in careful, educated handwriting. "I am sending you the personal journal of a man who called himself Caleb, though that was not his birth name. I found this journal among my grandfather's possessions after his death last year. My grandfather was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and helped many escaped slaves reach Canada in the years before and during the Civil War. Caleb was one of those he helped, and they remained friends until my grandfather's death in 1893. Caleb gave him this journal shortly before Caleb's own death in 1895, asking that it be preserved and eventually made public once enough time had passed that the truth could be told without endangering anyone. I believe enough time has now passed. The people described in these pages are long dead. The system they represented has been destroyed. But the story deserves to be known, both as a testament to one man's resistance and as a warning about what human beings become capable of when pushed to extremes. The journal itself was remarkable. Written in a neat, precise hand, it covered Caleb's life from approximately 1845 through 1893. It was not a daily diary, but a series of reflective entries written at various points over nearly 50 years, marked by location and significant events. Early life and the price of knowledge. The earliest entries describe Caleb's childhood in Haiti, where his mother, a woman of mixed ancestry who had been born free but was later enslaved, had taught him everything she knew about healing and plants. She had secretly taught him to read and write using a hidden Bible. My mother told me that knowledge was power, Caleb wrote in one of the earliest entries, but that for someone like me, marked by my white skin as different, treated with suspicion and fear by both blacks and whites, knowledge had to be hidden knowledge, applied carefully and sparingly. She told him he would never be able to live as a normal man, would never be fully accepted by any community, would always be seen as strange and threatening. Therefore, she said, I had to make my strangeness my strength. I had to become someone who understood more than others, who could see patterns they could not see, who could plan further ahead than they could imagine. She said I would have to be patient beyond normal human patience, and that I would have to accept loneliness as the price of survival. The journal described Caleb's mother's death when he was 17, killed by an overseer whom she had poisoned in self-defense. Caleb was sold shortly afterward, beginning a progression of sales that took him across the South, a path marked by violence and by Caleb's growing willingness to use his knowledge as a weapon when circumstances became intolerable. I did not want to become what I had become, Caleb wrote in an entry from approximately 1849. I wanted to live quietly, but I learned that quietness is interpreted as weakness, that submission invites escalating cruelty, that the only thing that makes a master hesitate is fear, not obvious fear, but subtle fear, the uneasy sense that something is not quite right, that pushing too far might have consequences that cannot be predicted or controlled. I learned to cultivate that subtle fear, and I learned that when necessary, when a master became too dangerous to be merely feared, he could be eliminated in ways that looked natural and inevitable. The Rutledge killing and escape. The journal described Rutledge's death in detail, confirming everything that Isaiah, the witnesses, and Rutledge's own journal had suggested. Caleb had indeed spent months poisoning his master, using plant extracts administered through patients, whom he had manipulated with promises that the substances would make Rutledge less cruel. The final confrontation had been planned to the smallest detail, timed to occur when Rutledge's body was weak enough that the final substances would cause immediate and catastrophic failure. I knew Rutledge would eventually decide to punish me, Caleb wrote. His type always does. They cannot tolerate the presence of someone they cannot understand or fully control. I made sure his suspicions focused on me at the right time. I wanted him to come to me to initiate the confrontation, so that what followed would appear to be self-defense. And I wanted witnesses so that what I had done would be remembered, so that other enslaved people would know that resistance was possible. The journal detailed Caleb's escape from Mississippi, traveling at night, moving through swamps and forests, and eventually making contact with Underground Railroad conductors who helped him reach free territory in Canada in late 1851. Post-slavery reflection. Caleb spent the next several years working odd jobs, but critically, he dedicated himself to self-education, reading everything he could find about medicine, chemistry, and biology. I educated myself, Caleb wrote, not out of love of learning for his own sake, but out of a need to understand what I had done and what I was capable of doing. I needed to know whether I had killed Rutledge through some supernatural power, as some of the other slaves seemed to believe, or through simple application of natural substances that any trained person could use. The answer, I discovered, was the latter. There was nothing supernatural about what I had done. It was chemistry and biology and careful timing. But that knowledge did not comfort me. If anything, it made what I had done more disturbing because it meant I had become what I had always feared becoming. Someone for whom killing was not a desperate last resort, but rather a technical problem to be solved through planning and knowledge. The remaining journal entries detail Caleb's service in the Civil War, followed by his later life in Canada, and concluded with his final, poignant reflections on the cost of his survival. The remaining journal entries detail Caleb's service in the Civil War, followed by his later life in Canada, and concluded with his final, poignant reflections on the cost of his survival. Cross Swords, Service and Survival, 1860s. The journal entries from the 1860s describe Caleb's service in the Civil War, fighting for the Union under an assumed name. He used his medical knowledge, which he had developed to kill his oppressor, to now save lives on the battlefield. This presented a profound internal struggle for him, grappling with the contradiction of his skills. He was wounded twice but recovered faster than the doctors expected, eventually mustering out in 1865 with an honorable discharge and a small pension. Canada Life in Anonymity and Final Reflections. The later entries, spanning the 1870s through the early 1890s, described a life of quiet anonymity in Canada. Caleb worked as an herbalist and an informal medical consultant, developing a reputation for understanding illness in ways conventional doctors did not. He remained solitary, never married, and spent much of his time reflecting on the cost of his actions. In one of his final entries, dated around 1893, Caleb, then in his 60s, wrote, "I survived, but I cannot say I truly lived in any meaningful sense. I became a ghost long before I was called that name. I hollowed myself out to survive, removed everything soft and vulnerable, transformed myself into an instrument of resistance and revenge. And when the need for that instrument passed, when slavery ended and the system that created me was destroyed, I found I did not know how to be human again. The price of my resistance was my humanity, and I do not know if that was a fair trade or simply the only trade available to me." His final reflection was both chilling and sad, concluding with a profound statement on oppression. "I have no regrets about what I did, but I have no satisfaction either. I killed several men who deserved to die, but their death did not end slavery or heal the damage it caused. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: oppression creates monsters on both sides. Rutledge was a monster made by a system. I became a monster made by that same system, shaped by necessity. The true tragedy is not that either of us died, but that the system that created us both continued for so long, creating so many monsters, destroying so many lives. I pray that future generations will learn from this history." Classical Building, the journal's publication and legacy. The Historical Society ultimately published Caleb's journal in 1950 with extensive annotations. Controversy and authentication. The publication caused controversy, with some questioning its authenticity or argue it was an overly sympathetic portrait of a murderer. However, forensic analysis of the paper and ink confirmed it was written in the mid to late 19th century, and the contents contained details that could only have been known by an eyewitness. Pharmacological validation. Medical historians, such as Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell in 1952, were impressed, noting that the methodologies described aligned perfectly with modern understanding of the toxic properties of the plants used. She concluded that Caleb's work was applied science and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of pharmacokinetics, how substances are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted. The spread of fear and hope the story's legend spread through enslaved communities. Descendants shared testimonies, like that of Marie Dawson's great-great-grandmother, who noted that after Rutledge's death, other plantation owners in the area became much more careful, stopping the worst beatings and even hiring food tasters. This fear, spread by the idea that a slave could kill a master without leaving evidence, was described as being worth almost as much as freedom. The story of Caleb became a legend, a source of hope because it proved resistance was possible, and a source of caution because it illustrated the terrible personal cost of such resistance, transforming a person into something cold and calculating. Scientific confirmation of the crime scene. Forensic investigators in the 1960s, using newly developed techniques, examined the soil samples that had been preserved from the site where Rutledge's body had been found. They confirmed the presence of unusually high concentrations of certain alkaloids and plant compounds that matched the substances Caleb had described using. The concentration was particularly high in the central area where the blood had pooled, and chemical analysis suggested these compounds had indeed come from the plants Caleb had mentioned: pokeweed, white snakeroot, foxglove, and water hemlock. What we're looking at here is essentially a 19th century poisoning that can now be confirmed using 20th century forensic science, wrote Dr. James Patterson in a 1967 article in Toxicology Today. The methodologies described in Caleb's journal are scientifically sound. The substances he used would indeed have produced the effects he described. This was not luck or coincidence. This was deliberate, knowledgeable, and expertly executed. Hourglass not done, the final census and legacy. The last confirmed reference to Caleb appeared in Canadian census records from 1891, where a man matching his description, albino Negro, age approximately 64, occupation herbalist, unmarried, no children, was listed as living alone near Toronto. The 1901 census showed no such person, suggesting Caleb had died sometime in the 1890s. As his journal indicated, he had died as he had lived, anonymously, leaving minimal trace. In 1998, the Warren County Historical Society erected a small marker near the site of the former Rutledge plantation. The marker does not name Caleb or the specific circumstances of the death, but acknowledges the complexity of the historical record. On this land stood the Rutledge plantation, site of one of the most controversial incidents in Warren County history. In September 1851, plantation owner Nathaniel Rutledge died under circumstances that remain disputed. Official records attributed his death to natural causes. Other accounts suggest he was killed by an enslaved person using sophisticated knowledge of plant toxins. Whatever the truth, this incident serves as a reminder that the history of slavery is not simple, that resistance took many forms, and that enslaved people possess intelligence, knowledge, and agency that the system of slavery attempted but failed to completely suppress. We remember all who lived and died here. Both the oppressor and the oppressed. The marker sparked controversy and debate, forcing a public confrontation with the complexity of the past. Perhaps the most telling commentary came from Dr. Angela Freeman, an African-American historian, in a 2003 article titled The Ethics of Resistance, Reconsidering Violence in the Context of Slavery. We are uncomfortable with Caleb because his story forces us to confront questions we would prefer to avoid. Was he justified in killing Rutledge? By modern legal standards, no. But can modern legal standards be applied to a system where enslaved people had no legal recourse, no protection, no recognition as human beings with rights? Caleb chose violence, but he chose it carefully, methodically, and after exhausting all other options. He did not kill randomly or out of passion. He used knowledge rather than physical force, planning rather than rage. And he paid a terrible price for his resistance, losing his humanity even as he preserved his physical life. The real question is not whether we approve of what Caleb did, but rather what his story reveals about the nature of oppression and resistance. Caleb was neither hero nor villain. He was a human being pushed beyond normal human limits who responded with intelligence, courage, and ruthlessness in equal measure. His story should disturb us. It should make us uncomfortable, and it should make us determined to build societies where such desperate measures are never necessary. The cotton fields when Nathaniel Rutledge died have long since returned to wilderness. The people who witnessed that September morning in 1851 are long dead, but their descendants carry forward the stories whispered in slave quarters. The white ghost of Warren County was never a ghost at all. He was a man named Caleb, armed with knowledge his mother had taught him, driven by wrongs, and willing to pay the ultimate price, not death, but the loss of his own humanity, to strike back against a system that sought to destroy him. His story reminds us that the people we've been taught to see as helpless victims were often anything but helpless. They were thinking, planning, resisting in ways both obvious and subtle, demonstrating that even in the most oppressive circumstances, human beings retain the capacity for agency, for planning, for resistance, and for actions that permanently alter the course of individual lives and collective history. Caleb lived and Caleb killed, and Caleb died. These are the facts. Everything else, whether he was justified, whether his actions were heroic or horrific, remains forever open to interpretation, forever contested, and forever forcing us to confront the terrible choices that oppression imposes on those who refuse to submit to it. Would you like me to summarize the key evidence and facts supporting Caleb's plan and actions, or would you like to explore the themes of moral ambiguity and resistance in the context of the historical setting?